Okay, look guys, I know it. This sucks. And not so good with the video. It's my first video. If you want to see my no scope in high-rise with Commander Port, you gotta watch the next video. It's gonna be pretty sick video. Open on. Okay, now my friends is gonna play a little bit cause he is from Xbox. He's pretty good at it, not so good in PlayStation. Okay, he's 1 year old. I'm just kidding, he's 9 year old. And yeah, pretty sick. Yeah. I'm just wondering to Zerka how I can do a song in video like Zerka. I don't understand. They're so pretty sick. I played them in real and I lost and stuff. But I got to show that I am better than Zerka in quickscope and in nice skill. So are you gonna watch my video? And good luck guys. Good luck. Okay, but guys, I'm actually from Norway. Actually, I have hack, not so big hack.